My name's Janet Newsham, and I'm the coordinator at Greater Manchester Hazard Centre. This is the second meeting that we've run on long COVID support. It came about as an action from the North West trade unions, the sort of joint trade unions COVID action group that we set up last year. We set up we put together a long COVID charter to try and support workers with COVID, and also to support reps who are trying to support workers, their members with COVID, and also about trying to look at the mitigations that are necessary. That it's not just COVID hasn't gone away, and there's a lot of people vulnerable out there. So it was to try and encapsulate all that into a charter, and this is across the Northwest, by the way. And then we've set up, so Jen's coordinating that, Jen Worley, that's on the call, the Bereaved Family Support Group as well, looking to support those families who've lost loved ones from COVID, and they're having another meeting this week of that group. But so the first meeting that we held about a month or so ago, we had a speaker from Thompson Solicitors talking about some of the issues around around COVID, and certainly it was quite heartbreaking. I would have said heart-wrenching to listen to some of your stories, and the unreasonable phased returns that you've been expected to endure. And then also, I think what came out was the fact that some reps, we've got a lot of new reps at the beginning of COVID, and reps weren't able to. I didn't have the confidence or didn't have the knowledge to be able to support their members. And there was all issues around workers that were isolated at home, not knowing where to contact, who to, what employers could should be doing really, and being driven back to work because of lack of pay, people needing pension and benefit support, a real lot of fear about losing jobs, and the additional stress that was causing, and what that that ill health was causing to their health in addition. So there was a load of issues that came up last time, and we held at our last COVID action group, we talked about some of those issues, and Unison have put in place some measures to try and address some of those issues, some specific training for reps, some issues around mentor networking that come up of experienced reps, looking to support inexperienced reps, and sort of training on return to work and reasonable adjustments, etc. So there's a whole host of different actions that we're trying to take up and trying to progress. And to that end, I invited somebody from the TUC to speak to us this evening, and Alice has kindly agreed to speak to us. And she's a TUC, an equality group at the TUC, and she'll perhaps tell us a bit more about what she does, and she's going to hopefully address us and talk a bit about reasonable adjustments in the survey that they've just done. So over to you, Alice. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll take some questions at the end, if that's okay. I know you've got to leave early because you've got other commitments, but as long as you can stay, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. And thanks so much for inviting me, Janet. It's great to be here. And it's really nice to see that these groups are being set up, and kind of great to see so many people here on a Monday evening to come and talk about it, because we know it is affecting lots and lots of people, and in particular in certain sectors, especially in health and in education. So yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about just some of the national level stuff that we're seeing on long COVID at the moment. The survey that we did And then the kind of, in that survey, we asked quite a lot of questions about reasonable adjustments and what people needed from their employers. So to just run through the kind of common themes that we're seeing and examples from different sectors. And I just wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to an organisation called Long COVID Support, who some of you might have heard of. They are a charity that are run by people with long COVID, and we've worked with their employment group quite closely on everything we've done on long COVID, and in particular this survey that we've just released. And a thanks to our Disabled Workers Committee, who obviously support with all of our kind of work related to disabled workers. As Janet said, I sit in the equality team and kind of do work across the different equality areas, but what the two kind of key things I lead on are long COVID and flexible working, which actually have quite a lot of overlap, given that kind of flexibility in working hours and location is a key reasonable adjustment that people with long COVID and many other people with kind of energy limiting impairments need from their employers. So yeah, just to give a bit of a kind of overview before I go into the TUC work, the ONS have been collecting data on long COVID for a while now, and the latest data, this is from February of this year, shows that there are about 2 million people in the UK self-reporting long COVID, and it was slightly more than 2 million at points last year, and it kind of seems to fluctuate depending on time of year and obviously people completing the survey and things like that. It shows that there are certain groups of people who are more likely to be reporting symptoms of long COVID. So at the moment, those groups are people aged 35 to 69, so very much a working age population. Women, and I think that is reflective of the fact of the sectors where you kind of saw the highest rates of COVID infection. Oh, I'm seeing a shaking head, so maybe I'm wrong. That was my guess. So I will very happily be corrected. That would be very helpful. People living in deprived areas, those working in social care, people aged 16 or over who are not working or not looking for work, and disabled people. That group of people who are aged 16 or over and not working and not looking for work is a new group of people that has come through in the data. The ONS haven't provided any reasoning for it, but one of the suggestions is that it could be that people with long COVID were previously in employment and are now moved into that group of not looking for work. Of those 2 million people, around 1.2 million had tested positive for COVID at least a year ago. And of those 2 million, 1.5 million say that their ability to undertake day-to-day activities has been adversely affected. And of them, about 380,000 say their ability to undertake day-to-day activities has been limited a lot. I just wanted to flag as well that the ONS have announced that they're pausing their COVID survey, which is where this data has come from and where all the national level COVID data has come from. For example, infection levels, hospitalizations, deaths, and vaccinations. They're saying they're currently reviewing what they're going to do in the upcoming year, but we've written to them to urge them to carry on with the data collection, because it's obviously really important in terms of highlighting the numbers of people that are still being infected with COVID. We know it hasn't gone away, and also the numbers of people who are experiencing long COVID. So the work that the TUC have done, we did a survey back in 2021 on people's experiences of work, and we've redone that survey back in October of last year, which we just published the results in March of this year. So that survey was of around 3,000 people who had long COVID, and we asked a host of questions around symptoms, people's experiences of work, including reasonable adjustments and treatment at work. We also asked some questions about the financial implications they were experiencing. For this session, I'll just go into the stuff that's kind of specifically related to work, but I'll share a link to the report so you can have a look at stuff like the financial implications. There's quite shocking stuff in there about people now relying on food banks and the kind of implications of having to leave work and drop hours as a result of having long COVID. So our survey found that, so 2/3 of respondents said they had experienced some form of negative treatment at work. And that was up from around half of respondents in the 2021 survey. So it's not the same people all completing both surveys, but what we've seen is a trend of things seem to be getting worse. So that big jump in the number of people experiencing negative treatment. And that included things like bullying and harassment at work, kind of threatened with capability procedures being triggered, triggers from sickness absence procedures, being asked to do kind of less skilled tasks or being given unpopular tasks in comparison to colleagues. And really worryingly, we saw that 14% of people said they'd lost their jobs because of reasons related to long COVID. So that's a really high percentage of respondents. And again, it was only 5% of respondents who said that in 2021. So whilst we can't make the direct comparisons, it does seem that there are a higher percentage of people now losing their jobs and experiencing negative treatment. Around a quarter of respondents said their employer had questioned whether they had long COVID or the impact of their symptoms. So a really common theme was comments from employers, for example, kind of saying things like, oh, everyone's tired, why can't you just manage? And really not understanding things like fatigue and brain cognitive impairment in particular. Around a third said they were concerned that long COVID had affected their chances for promotion at work. Around 1/6 said they had experienced bullying and harassment at work related to long COVID. 8% told us they'd been threatened with disciplinary action. And around over a quarter, so 27%, said the amount of sickness leave they had taken had triggered an absence management or HR process. And over 1 in 10 had used all of their sick leave and were being told that there would be negative consequences as a result. A really common theme as well that came through was the kind of injustice that people felt around the fact that a lot of people had caught COVID at work to start with, and were now experiencing negative treatment or discrimination or disadvantage by that same employer who had failed to keep them safe in the first place. So around half of respondents said they had reason to believe they'd contracted COVID at work. We asked a whole host of questions about accessing reasonable adjustments as well. And I think probably not surprising to anyone in the group, there were a lot of barriers in even asking for reasonable adjustments to start with. So around 12% of those 3,000 people said they hadn't told their employer that they had long COVID symptoms. And the most common reason was a lack of a medical diagnosis. And other reasons where they didn't think their employer would do anything, or they were worried it would be viewed negatively. And then, so kind of that 88% who had told their employer they had long COVID, around a third of them hadn't asked for any reasonable adjustments or changes to work. And again, largely that was for the same reasons. They were worried about being viewed negatively, they didn't have a medical diagnosis, or they didn't think any changes would be approved by their employer. And then in the survey, looking at the kind of people who did ask for changes, around a third who asked for them said their employer had made all of the changes they requested. But that was down from our survey in 2021, where 44% of respondents said they had made all those changes. So again, that sort of worsening of a situation since 2021. And around half said they hadn't been given any or all of the adjustments that they asked for, either to return to work in the first place or when they were at work to manage their job. The types of, we asked people what adjustments they needed and what they'd asked for. And we asked what they had asked for and what they had received from their employer. And there were 2 adjustments where more people were given it by their employer than they'd actually asked for, and they were a phased return to work. So 54% of people had asked for it and 65% of people had actually had a phased return to work. And occupational health as well, so a referral to occupational health advisor. The kind of overall themes that came out around phased return to work are similar to what Janet was saying in the beginning, this idea that a standard phase return to work would work for people with long COVID, and this expectation that once you've finished your 4-week phased return to work, you would be fine to go back to the way you were doing your job before you caught COVID. So same workload, same hours, same location, everything the same. And this just very unrealistic expectation and a lack of understanding around the fluctuating condition. And there was this kind of narrative that came out from the findings of this expectation from employers that you were kind of either in work fully as they expected you to be in work, or you were out of work, and there was no sort of middle ground. The most often asked for reasonable adjustments were, as I said, a phased return to work. The second one was flexibility to support fluctuating symptoms. The third one was amended duties, temporary change or reduction in hours, and then support from occupational health. But what we saw was that flexible working was one of the hardest adjustments to get when we compared people who asked for and what they got from their employer. So 54% of people asked for flexibility to support fluctuating symptoms, but only less than a third had actually got that from their employers. And again, longer or more frequent breaks, just under half of people have asked for that, but only around a third had received it from their employers. Physical changes to the workplace, around 17% had asked for that, but only around half had got that from their employers. Permanent home working, 18% of people had asked for that, but again, only half of them had received it. And other changes to people's hours, again, a quarter of people asked for that, but only 15% received it. So seeing this real mismatch between what people need and what they're actually getting from their employers. From what we asked people about the length of time they'd been experiencing long COVID, and how it had affected their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, it was very clear that many people who had completed the survey would likely meet that definition of disabled under the Equality Act. So not only are employers kind of not doing the right thing in terms of how they should be supporting their staff, but a lot of them are likely to be falling foul of the Equality Act in terms of disability discrimination. People also shared in the comments that they'd asked for health and safety adjustments, so improved ventilation in their workplace, access to PPE, and a lot of that had been denied as well. And as I said before, a lot of people, even if they had the adjustments put in place, kind of said in the comments that they might have the adjustment, but an expectation around workload had not changed. So there's still that pressure from managers to be keeping up and keeping pace. And what came through a lot is this failure to provide reasonable adjustments and the failure to support people properly, with leading to people relapsing and symptoms worsening, and then people having to go off work again. So this idea of work is actually injuring people and limiting their ability to be able to recover. Just to go through some of the kind of types of adjustments that people mentioned to us that kind of haven't gone through in the stats, and that we've heard kind of through affiliates that people are finding helpful, is sickness absence is obviously a very big one, and kind of the inclusion of long COVID in sickness absence policies, removing of triggers from sickness absence policies for people with long COVID, or giving people access to disability leave, so they can have paid time off for leave they need to take in connection to their long COVID. We've also, I know that education unions have negotiated with a lot of schools and academies around suspending sort of performance management processes or capability processes, whilst any adjustments are being implemented, or kind of in that transition period where people are figuring out what they need to be able to return to work. Or, for example, where they're waiting for NHS treatment, because we know that there are huge backlogs in access to care, and in particular in certain parts of the country. I know this has been a big issue in Wales. Or, for example, while someone is waiting for an access to work assessment, so putting a pause on any of those processes that could trigger a capability issue or a disciplinary whilst those processes are being figured out. The other reasonable adjustments that people tended to ask for were individualised risk assessments, and we would recommend that any employer does that for anyone returning to work with long COVID. redeployment to a different role or different tasks, hybrid working, flexi hours, things like additional equipment. I was in a webinar where a teacher made a really good suggestion of they asked for an ergonomic chair in their classroom and in their break rooms. So it means that when you are resting, your body is properly supported to rest. And you're not sitting on a kind of classroom chair or stool or something that is going to require kind of physical exertion from yourself. Other physical changes to the workplace. One other adjustment that someone had got from their employer or asked for was they had kind of repetitive tasks within their job, and what they just had was a checklist. So at the beginning of every day and throughout the day, they could go back and they knew exactly what all their tasks were, and it helped with their cognitive impairment. So kind of little support things like that can be extremely helpful, and having additional line management support for that period when you are returning to work for as long as you need it. A lot of people had tried, we know there's kind of huge failures and problems with the access to work scheme, but it can support with things like getting taxis to work, which can be very helpful to avoid the exhaustion that people feel when they are commuting. I'll share a link in the chat as well, but the education unions have put together a joint protocol for schools to sign up to in relation to long COVID, which includes a lot of those reasonable adjustments and some other issues. And I was just going to end by saying just a quick bit about kind of like some practical tips that we've heard that reps have kind of done and have been helpful. So I think the first one is the kind of stats at the beginning showed there is still hesitancy and huge hesitancy around talking to your employer about having long COVID. And that is not unique to long COVID. We know that is an issue for many disabled workers in the workplace. But to encourage people to share their long COVID symptoms with their employer, because if the employer doesn't know, they can claim that they had no idea they needed to put in place any adjustments or changes. The theme around medical diagnosis coming through, I would say it's really important to remind people they don't need to have a positive test of COVID to prove that they are experiencing long COVID, and they don't need a diagnosis. So your ability to access reasonable adjustments is around the impact it's having on your life, not on your diagnosis of a condition. But on the flip side, I would say is always very helpful for members to be getting medical evidence. That doesn't need to be a diagnosis, but unfortunately we just know it makes the process easier if they've got things like notes from their GP or anything like that, or again, an occupational health assessment. I was just going to say as well, long COVID is an umbrella term. So there are about 200 symptoms that people can experience. So people's experiences could be very different depending on the symptoms they have. But saying that fatigue and cognitive impairment do always come through as very common symptoms. So this means that kind of I guess your bread and butter repping becomes even more important with someone who's got an energy limiting impairment, because things like attending meetings with someone, taking notes, record keeping, and supporting someone with the kind of admin of going through a workplace issue, or that just the admin that is associated with sickness, or the kind of sickness absence procedures at work, supporting people to be able to do that stuff becomes really important, just because if people aren't able to retain the information from the meetings, and especially when you're in a very stressful situation. Negotiating around reasonable adjustment passports can be helpful. So once a reasonable adjustment has been put in place, getting it written down and agreed in a passport. So if someone's line manager changes or they move to a different job within the same organisation, they've got that written down already and they don't have to go through the process again of renegotiating reasonable adjustments. And supporting people with any access to work applications and signposting them to kind of other government services that might support them. Yeah, they were the kind of tips that we've heard that have been useful. I just wanted to end as well by saying, obviously the discussion is about long COVID, but I don't think anything I've said is unique to long COVID. And what we're seeing is that people with long COVID are experiencing the same challenges and barriers in the workplaces that many disabled workers experience. So kind of upskilling and understanding more about long COVID, all of that knowledge is kind of transferable to when dealing with other disability related issues in the workplace. I'll put some links in the chat as well to the report, but there's also some really good resources from long COVID work. The Society of Occupational Medicine have got some good guidance around reasonable adjustments, and I'm sure hazards themselves have got some very helpful information, especially around kind of safety in relation to COVID and COVID infection. And I'm just going to say that is really, really important, because the research is obviously now showing that if you have long COVID and you get COVID again, it can cause you to relapse or worsen your symptoms. So this idea that it doesn't matter if you catch it again is really wrong and has to be challenged.